updates. Good morning, and welcome to Good Morning Tobago right here on Tobago Updates, guys. This morning, we are having some excellent conversations like we always do here on GMT. And you know, when you see me here, it's because we're having those conversations that you want to have and asking those questions that you want to know. And as I said, this morning is like no other, and we're going to be diving into some really interesting conversations. This morning, to start off our discussions, I have the privilege of sitting with me today the president of the National Joint Action Committee, who would be joining us virtually, and that is Mr. Embahu Mohini. And as well in studio, I have Mr. Opoku Ware, who is a former member of the National Joint Action Committee. Good morning, sir. How are you doing?
Good.
I look forward to your colleague joining us online, so he should be with us shortly. It's very interesting because this morning you're here and we're talking about the 1970 movement. And for those people who are not really sure about what the 1970 movement is, that was the Black Power movement in Trinidad and Tobago that happened at the time. And although we often overlook the activities that took place in Tobago, it indeed was a countrywide activity that happened on both islands. Now, we had a number of young persons that came out in their thousands that came out and demonstrated on the streets of Port of Spain and Scarborough in Tobago during this time. And this morning, we're going to talk a bit about that. And Mr. Opoku Ware, who is one of the former members, is going to be here to explore that a bit with us.
Well, it's good to be here because this period of the year, Mohini join us, huh?
I see him there. I see we have your colleague there.
All right, good. Let Mohini start off now.
Mr. Mohini, can you hear us?
Are you hearing me?
Hear you very clearly. Thank you so much for joining us on Mr. Opoku Ware, who's your colleague here. He said, go ahead and let you start off the interview.
It's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure.
It's nice to
and
have
as
you
Opoku
here.
said, yes, thank you. And good morning to the viewers. As Opoku said, this is a significant period in that the focal point of the demonstrations and the movement and the transformation would have been between the 26th of February and the 21st of April. So it is indeed a significant period. However, what I wanted to get across as well is the fact that we are having an international conference which was actually scheduled for the 20th and the 21st of April 2020 until we were bowled googly by the COVID. So that conference is now coming up on the same 20th and 21st, but this time in 2023. And we still refer to it as a 50th anniversary because that is what it was all about. We were only able to host one event that year, which was on the 26th of February. And after that, COVID sort of put everything else on the back burner. So we are having this event on the 20th and the 21st of April. It's being held at the Daga Auditorium at the University of the West Indies, which incidentally is a very spot where NJAC was formed in 1969, because at that time, most of the leaders were actually students of the university. So we are going back to that spot on the 20th and the 21st of April, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., 2 days of that conference.
Okay, and so with this conference, the conference is going on from the 20th to the 21st. And what can we look forward to seeing happening at this conference? What type of conversations are we looking forward to? Who is invited? What can the public really expect when coming to this conference for the 50th anniversary?
Okay, well, you are invited along with the public. However, by tomorrow, when we have our next meeting, we will be After the meeting, however, when we work out the link, we're going to send the link out, so we make it public, and we hope it would be on updates as well, so that people could register online. Those who are going to be actually
Mohini,
Hello,
he
sir.
went out a bit there. So he's saying that he
taking
will
the
send the link.
conference virtual. Unfortunately, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. You went out a bit. So you are saying that a part of the conference would be held virtually so that individuals can join online?
Yes, because the Daga Auditorium could only host 450 persons. As a matter of fact, we are in pursuing with the Ministry of Education as well as the Division of Education in Tobago to have, even if it is a few students present at the event, so they could get it live, and we hope that it could be conveyed to other students, simply because 1970 is a period that transformed Trinidad and Tobago. The consciousness swept up the Caribbean. There was a Caribbean historical, there's a Caribbean Liberation Steering Committee, had representation from Guyana, Barbados, Grenada, Dominica. As a matter of fact, the Roosevelt Rosie Douglas, who became Prime Minister of Dominica, was on that committee, as well as Maurice Bishop and a number of. It was a movement, and Tobago benefited largely from it, as well as Trinidad and Tobago. And our call at this point, we need all hands on deck, because we all benefited from that great movement of 1970.
All
Possibly
right.
could hear from Brother Opoku.
Right. And Mr. Opoku Ware, what we want to know is how functional is the party NJAC at this time?
Well, Mohini will speak about that part.
Okay.
But what I would say, well, my voice is not too good this morning, but what I would say is that 1970 represented the greatest political event in Trinidad and Tobago since the uprising by Butler in 1937. Trinidad and Tobago and the entire Caribbean, the politics was transformed by the movement of 1970. What we had in 1970 was a surge, a massive surge in the consciousness and understanding among African and Indian people about where they were at and where they have to go. Because at that time, Trinidad and Tobago was the people, the masses, were under total exploitation and oppression, not only from the government, but most of the institutions. For example, the entire economy was most of the economy was in foreign hands. Oil, sugar, most of the lands in Tobago were owned by foreigners. Banking, insurance, all that were in the hands of foreigners. People had to leave this country to get employment. There was no employment for young people. There was a period in Tobago where the roads were not fit for donkeys to travel on. The education system was in shambles. You had about 1 or 2 secondary schools. Then you had, for example, in terms of the social services, water was places like Bethel, Patience Hill, Mason Hall, they had all problems with water. So, and there was no hope for the people. And this was 8 years after independence from the British. So the people, when Makandal Daga arrived here, it was easy to mobilize the people. But before 1970, there was activity happening in Tobago. You had people like Baylis Frederick, who was a lawyer, who was carrying on, because at that time they didn't want, you couldn't bail on certain beaches, places like Pigeon Point, Bacalet, all up in Speyside. They didn't want the people to be going and so be mixing with the tourists and so on. So we had that kind of protest. Baylis Frederick led that protest. You had people like Dupoy Ewing, who was a trade unionist and who was an activist. You had, and then after that, the important thing with Tobago is that a guy called Tony McFarlane came back from Canada. He was in the university at Sir George Williams came back to Tobago and he started to educate the brothers and sisters around the blocks in Tobago about the importance of African people getting together and knowing themselves. Because you know, in those days, it was a crime to be a black. You used to consider you're black and ugly, you're black and stupid, you know.
Right.
So that we needed to raise the level of understanding among our people so that we could be able to move forward as a conscious people to achieve beautiful things and open up opportunities. So today we could have African people owning this program here. We could have you as an African sister sitting down here. That was
Right.
not possible before 1970.
Understood.
Only white people work in the banks in 1970, right then.
Excellent. And thank you so much for giving us that historical context of what really would have triggered that 1970 Black Power movement. And Mr. Mohini, what we want to find out is, do you see any similarities in some of the struggles that were faced then to what we're seeing happening now in Trinidad and Tobago? And although then the movement would have been so revolutionary, what type of similar movements can you see happening in today's society that might be I should say a bit less. Well, how can we
Radical.
phrase that, a bit less radical than what we would have seen in 1970?
I think we need something more radical. But the point I would make, you are talking about comparing then and now, this and that. It is one struggle, because I was there in 1970. I remember when the chief servant, Macandal Dagger, then Geddes Granger, landed in the Scarborough car park on the 3rd of April. And in keeping with continuing from where Bolo Puku left off, I remember him saying that our people have to stop the crouching of the shoulders and stand tall and proud as a people. So that pride was being re-established. And 1970 was such a fantastic movement, as Brother Opoku stated, because the demonstrations only lasted from the 26th of February to the 21st of April. And within that time span, you could hear people begin to talk about the new consciousness. People were now becoming more conscious of themselves, of their heritage, of their culture, beginning to develop a new African pride. There was the question of national unity, because there was a demonstration from the Woodford Square down to Caroni, down to Chaguanas, and down to Couva. And in that entire demonstration, it is estimated that about 40,000 persons took part to unite the Africans and the Indians. And that unity was being cemented. It was being cemented. It was achieved. African brothers who couldn't make their way back to Port of Spain that night were housed in their hundreds. The community in Cuba just opened their doors to total strangers. This is the love and the togetherness. The principle was, be a brother, be a sister, honor the old, respect and elevate the woman. And our young persons and our nation were accepting these principles and taking it into their lives, so much so that I could recall within communities, persons who had loggerheads with each other buried the hatchet and began to say, well, listen, if the movement is about love and togetherness, let us put our differences aside. Let us put our enmity aside. This is where Tobago and Trinidad was heading. And I should state as well that the nation recorded the lowest, or not the lowest, the highest reduction in the level of crime. In 1970, crime went down by 56%. Not even that convinced our leaders to adopt a different attitude to the movement. No, we were fighting against a colonial system which had extended itself into a so-called democratic nation, democratic and independent nation, so that the movement was fighting to as Bolopuku said, control the commanding heights of the economy. In Tobago, for instance, in 1970, over 70% of the best land was in the hand of either foreigners or a local white elite. And in 1970, because of the mass demonstrations and the demands of the people, the government was forced to buy out 13 of those major estates to bring it back into the hands of our people. Um, in 1970, there was no local bank. All the commercial banks were owned by foreigners. And yet, the demands again, overnight, the then Prime Minister Williams was forced to buy out the Bank of London and Montreal and set up National Commercial Bank, which eventually merged with Workers' Bank and the so-called Penny Bank to form First Citizens, so that NJAC and the masses, because the masses cannot be forgotten in terms of their heroic actions, pounding the streets of this country for 55 days and calling for a new and just society that was largely responsible. For instance, when the chief servant landed in Scarborough and he said he wanted 100% increase in the wages and salaries for store workers, it wasn't just Macandal Daga speaking. He had thousands of people gathering in the car park, demonstrating to Pigeon Point. As a matter of fact, today is the anniversary of that demonstration down to Mount Irving, down to Pigeon Point, as well as by boat to the Boko Reef to reclaim our heritage, to reclaim the rights, and to give our people economic liberation and justice.
Question. So the event that you guys are having at the Macandal Daga Auditorium at the University of the West Indies from the 20th to the 21st, what is the overall aim of that event? Is it just to pay respect to the 1970 movement? What exactly are you guys trying to get out of that event?
It is most of all, yes, to pay respect, but beyond that, it is to begin to enlighten the population, because our young students are writing CXC. Good. It is NJAC that said the Caribbean must have its own examination. When I was in school, there was no CXC. We had to wait on London and Cambridge, University of London, University of Cambridge, for the GCE, for them to send papers, for us to write about an environment in which we were not living in, of which we knew little. So that CXC was established in 1972, okay? And our young students need to know that. Our population, the parents need to know that. They need to know that when they go and they get their NIS benefits, it is NJAB that said in 1970 that any government that cannot insure its own people does not deserve to exist. Okay, so it is more than just paying respects. Yes, 50 years, yes, we are paying respects, but more than that, our people need to understand that had it not been for 1970, we were not going to enjoy the oil boom, because in 1970, 96% of the oil revenue was leaving our country. And this is why NJAC stood up with the masses and said, we don't want crumbs, we want the whole bread. Right? The Republican Constitution would not have come into being. When was that set up? The commission was set up in 1971, 1 year after 1970, the Hugh Woodin Constitution Commission, giving us, after 5 years, by 1976, we now had our own Republican Constitution with our own president, not having to wait on the Queen of England or the King as we have now, who would have been our head of state. So 1970 transformed governance, it transformed the economy, right? It gave birth to the public sector, because in 1970, only 3.8% of the national population involved in business were Africans. Only 4% were Indians. 1970 opened the doors for our people to get involved in business. As a matter of fact, what we were told during that period before 1970 is that black people can't run business. This was the stigma. And all of that was transformed with our people. Point Lisas could not have been a reality had it not been for 1970. The then Prime Minister was, when he went to the conference in Lima, was negotiating the sellout the few corporate bodies that were under the ownership of the government, which at that time was only 8, right? A few years after 1970, it grew and it grew and it grew until it reached something like 60, 67 such institutions, okay? All the banks in this country were mandated to localize. And when I say localize, 51% minimum ownership.
Okay, and it seems like we're having a technical difficulties there with Mr. Mohini. So we're gonna wrap up this interview this morning, and before we go, Mr. Opoku Ware, is there any academic sources that
National
has been
Commercial Bank.
created? Are you back with us, Mr. Mohini? You went out a
Hello?
bit.
Okay. I would just
Are
want to
there?
give an idea of some of the presenters at the conference. You have, for instance, a principal and pro-vice chancellor, Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine. You have Archbishop Charles Dayson Gordon. You have Professor Hamed Ghani, Dr. Patrick Watson, Brother Enyahuma Obika. You have myself. You have Kafa Kambon, who was there in 70s, Sister Lizelle Daga, Ago Ome, Brother Opoku Ware himself, Augustus Ramreka Singh, Olabisi Kuboni, Clyde Nunez, Ferdy Ferreira, and you also have the present director of Salises, who we are doing this conference jointly with Salises and the Caribbean Historical Society. That is Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard. So that is just an idea, because we have researchers, you have persons who were there, you have persons who made that march to Charlottesville, like Raviji, who is a well-known name in this country, who are going to be speaking at that conference as well. So it's going to be information. We're going to document, have documentation of it afterwards. The idea is to get this information out, because until our youths understand that it is their mothers and fathers and grandparents who created this great, powerful movement to transform Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, they are not going to understand their true value, and they are not going to be able to achieve or to achieve. And the elders will continue to be saying that the youths have gone astray.
Thank you so
We
much.
need to
And
stop.
again, we want to thank you, Mr. Mohini, as well as Mr. Opoku Ware, who's in the studio here with us this morning, for inviting Tobagonians to come out on the 20th and the 21st of April to the Makanda Daga Auditorium at the University of the West Indies to participate in this conference. And as you said, the link would be shared. So for persons who are not able to attend in person, you would be able to get that link. You would be able to watch it online. And guys, we want to participate and understand the importance that these events have played on today's society. So guys, we're going to go for a quick break, and we'll be back with much more conversation.
Let's go, go. It's a brand new morning, rise up to a brand new day.